I love you so much.
Oh, sorry guys, got done with making love with Twilight. It's my girlfriend, of course. Oh my gosh, yo. Sonic and Meg, did you mind that? You were watching us the whole time.
Yeah, we don't mind.
Yeah, it's just that we just don't want other people in here to see you guys doing that.
Yeah.
Okay, good. But today, we're gonna go with the 3 battlefields. Yep, we sure are. We're gonna go to Fort Henry. What's that other one called? Oh, Roanoke Island, something like that. And we're gonna go to Fort Donelson. Fort Henry, Roanoke Island, and Fort Donelson. Yep.
Yeah, Parker, it's pronounced Roko. Roko?
Yeah, Roko. Sometimes it's hard to say it.
Oh, Roko Island. Yeah, my bad. But anyways, let's go to there, and I can't imagine anything going wrong in this scenario at all.
Wow, this view looks great.
Yeah, it really does. We can see the river from here. It is great.
Wow! Look at this! Wow! Right here! Now, welcome to the Fort Henry and Fort Donelson battlefield. And we're next to the river here. Whew. Now, Sonic and Meg are right next to the cannons. To the Fort Donelson and Fort Henry cannons. Me and Twilight are on top of this hill where there's other cannons too. Yep. So now let's talk about where this battlefield is and where it was located. The Battle of Fort Henry was fought on February 6, 1862 in Stewart County, Tennessee during the American Civil War. It was the first important victory for the Union in Brigadier General Ulysses the Western Theater, which we'll talk about him in later. On February 4th and 5th, Grant landed 2 divisions just north of Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. The troops serving under Grant were the nucleus of the Union's successful Army of the Tennessee. Though that name was not yet in use, Grant's plan was to advance upon the fort on February 6th, while it was being simultaneously attacked by Union gunboats commanded by Flag Officer Andrew Hall Foote. A combination of accurate and effective naval heavy rain and poor sighting of the fort, nearly induced by rising river waters, caused its commander, Brigadier General Lloyd Heightman, to surrender to Foote before the Union Army arrived. The surrender of Fort Henry opened the Tennessee River to Union traffic upriver through and along West Tennessee to a point south of the Alabama border. In the days following the fort's surrender from February 6th through February, the Union raids used iron clay boats to destroy Confederate shipping and railroad bridges along the river. On February 12th, Grant's army proceeded overland 12 miles to engage with Confederate troops in the Battle of Fort Donelson. We'll talk about Fort Donelson in a little bit, but so just like I said, Fort Henry is in Stewart County. The key commander for this is USS Grant, Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote, Commander Seth Leard Phillips, and Brigade General Loyal Tightman. So approximately, the Union had 15 men and 7 ships, while the Confederate only had 3,000 to 3,400 men and just 17 heavy guns. Gosh, that's a lot of guns, but they still lost.
Parker, what date did this battle happen?
Well, Twilight, the date, it was a one-day battle, and the date was on February 6, 1862. Now, I'm going to tell you what happened before February 6, 1862. In early 1861, the critical border state of Kentucky had declared neutrality in the American Civil War. This neutrality was first violated on September 3rd when Confederate Brigade General Gibson J. Pillow, acting on orders from Major General Polk, occupied Columbus, Kentucky, which overlooked strong defensive bluffs, to defend the Mississippi from federal offensive action, and was the terminus of the Memphis and Ohio River, which in turn leads southward towards the extremely important Memphis Railroad. The riverside town was situated on 180 feet, 55 meters high bluffs that commanded at the river at the point where the Confederates installed 140 large guns underwater in a heavy chain that stretched a mile across the Mississippi River to Belmont, while occupying the town with 12,000 Confederate troops, thus cutting off northern commercials to the south and beyond. 2 days later, Union Brigade General USS Grant, displaying the personal effectivity that would characterize his later career, seized Paducah, Kentucky, a major transportation hub of rail and port at the mouth of the Tennessee River. Its fourth neither anniversary respected Kentucky's proclaimed neutrality, and the Confederate advantage was lost. The buffer zone that Kentucky provided between the North and South was no longer available to assist in the defense of Tennessee. By early 1862, a single general, Albert Sidney Johnston, commanded all the Confederate forces from Arkansas to the Cumberland Gap, but his forces were spread too thinly over a defensive line. Johnston's left flank was Polk in Columbus with 12,000 men. His right flank was Brigade General Simon Bolivar Buckner in Bowling Green, Kentucky, with 4,000 men. The center contained 2 forts, Forts Henry and Donelson, under the command of Brigade General Loyal Tightman. That's what I said earlier about him. Also with 4,000 men, Forts Henry and Donelson were the sole positions defending the important Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, respectively. If these rivers were open to the Union military traffic, 2 direct invasion paths would lead them to western and eastern Tennessee and the vital Memphis and South Carolina Railroad, and more. The Union military command in the West suffered from a lack of unified command and were organized into 3 separate departments: the Department of Kansas under Major General David Hunter, the Department of Missouri under Major General Henry Halkirk, and the Department of Ohio under Brigade General Don Carroll's Bullen. By January 1862, The disunion was apparently because they could not agree on a strategy for operations in the leader. Logan, under policy pressure to invade and hold pro-Union Eastern Tennessee, moved slowly in the direction of Nashville. In Halkern's department, Grant moved up the Tennessee River to divert attention from Buell's intended advance, which did not occur. Halleck and the other generals in the West were coming under policy pressure from President Abraham Lincoln to participate in the general offensive on Washington's birthday, February 22nd. That's George Washington's birthday, by the way. Despite his tradition of caution, Halleck eventually reacted positively to Grant's proposal to move against Fort Henry. Halleck hoped that would improve his standing in relation to his rival, Bulger. Halleck and Grant were also concerned about rumors that Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard would soon arrive with 15 Confederate regiments. On January 1862, Halter authorized General Grant to take Fort Henry. Yeah, he did that. Yeah, they were worried that Beauregard would come in with more Confederate forces. In no time, leaving Cairo, Illinois, at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. On February 2nd, his invasion force, which arrived on the Tennessee River on February 4th and 5th, consisted of 15,000 to 17,000 men in two divisions, commanded by Brigadier General John A. McClernand and Charles F. Smith, supported by the Western Gunboat Florin, commanded by United States Navy flag officer Andrew Hall Foote. The floated four ironclad gunboats, flagships, USS Cincinnati, USS Clarendon, USS St. Louis, and USS Essex. Under Foote's direct command, and three timber-clean gunboats, USS Tyler and USS Lexington, under Lieutenant General Seth Ledyard Phillips, and Suffragan transport ships this early in the war to deliver all the Army troops in a single operation required under Pure to reach the fort. General Johnston was persistent by the Confederate government to defend the Mississippi, Cumberland, and Tennessee rivers, and the important railroads in the region, to which he concerted his Fort Columbus, Forts Henry and Donelson, Russellville, Bowling Green, and the Cumberland Gap in eastern Kentucky. When Beauregard arrived at Bowling Green, he expected to find 40,000 Confederate soldiers at Bowling Green and another 30,000 ready to assume the offensive. Instead, he was shocked to see an army of 14,000 effects at Bowling Green, which with defined arms, equipment, and transportation. Beauregard said, quote, realizing how useless his prevent would be to General Johnston under the existing circumstances, informed that later that in his opinion he had best return at once to Virginia. Johnston convinced Beauregard to remain, but the latter was too ill to assume control of Fort Henry and Donelson. This was unfortunate, as Johnston desperately needed an officer with bow engineering skill to defend the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Fort Henry was considered illimitable due to its poor position in engineering, which made it highly successful to be flooded during a high tide and rain. It was token force of 3,000 to 4,000, including crews for the heavy guns. Johnston ordered timbermen to place naval mines in the Tennessee River to help defend Fort Henry, and to construct Fort Hedman opposite the fort on the Kentucky side of the Tennessee River to prevent its bombardment by federal artillery. Now let's talk about the actual battle. Okay, here we go. On February 4th and 5th, Grant landed his divisions in two different locations. McClellan's division was 3 miles, 4.8 kilometers north of the fort on the east bank of the Tennessee River to prevent the garrison escape. C.F. Smith's divisions, Confederate means, CF means Confederate General, by the way, Smith's division would seize Fort Hedman on the Kentucky side of the river and turn its artillery on Fort Henry. When rains the night of February 5th slowed the progress of Union troops toward the forts. The battle turned on naval actions, which concluded before the infantry saw action. Tight men realized that it was only time before Fort Henry fell. Only 9 guns remained above the water to mount a defense, while leaving artillery in the fort to hold off the Union gunboats. He ordered the majority of his force to march under the command of Colonel Hedman, the same guy, on the overland route to Fort Donelson, 12 miles, 19 kilometers away. Fort Edmund was abandoned on February 4th. Gunfire from the gunboats on Fort Henry garrison caused 4 Confederates, 1 killed, 3 wounded. On the afternoon of February 5th, all but a part of Company B, 1st Tennessee Artillery CSA, 54 men left on Fort Henry on February 5th. Union cavalry pursuing Confederates, but poor road conditions prevented any serious confrontation, and they took few captives. Tight men, as was his custom, spent the night on February 5th to 6th on the steamer Dunbar, 1 miles, 2.4 kilometers upstream from the fort. Around midnight, he sent an update on the situation to Johnston, then returned to Fort Henry just before dawn. On the morning of February 6th, their 7 Union guns arrived at Fort Henry and established their position around 12:30 p.m. They soon opened fire from a distance at 1,700 yards, around 1,554 meters, beginning an exchange of gunfire with Fort Henry for over an hour. After tight men rejected an initial call to surrender, the fleet continued to bombard the fort. This was its first engagement using newly designed and constructed ironclads. Foote developed the 4 gunboats in a line abreast, followed by the 3 timber-clads under the command of Seth Leard Phillips, which were held back for a long range but less an effective fire against the fort. The high water level of the river of Fort Henry's guns allowed Fulton's fleet to escape serious destruction. The Confederate fire was able to hit the ironclads only where the armor was the strongest. During the bombardment, all 4 of the Union ironclads were ripped by Confederate fire. The USS Essex was seriously damaged when a 32-pounder shot from Fort Henry penetrated the ironclad, hitting the middle boiler and sending scuttle steam through the half of the ship. 32 crewmen were killed or wounded, including Commander D. Porter. The ship was out of action for the remainder of the campaign. Now here's the aftermath of the battle. After the bombardment had lasted for 75 minutes, Tight men surrendered to Foote's fleet. which had close to within 400 yards for a close-range bombardment before the battle. Tideman told his men that he would offer an hour of resistance to allow his men additional time to escape, with only one working down to the last few rounds due to the powder magazine being underwater and the rest of the guns destroyed or knocked out. Tideman ordered the Confederate flag at Fort Henry lowered and a white sheet raised up on the fort's flag. Upon seeing the white flag, the Union gunboats immediately ceased fire. The flooded state of the fort was as such. The surrendering party sailed out of the Saley port of the fort in a small launch and picked up Tideman for the surrender. Negotiated on Cincinnati. 12 officers and 82 men at the garrison surrendered. Other casualties from the fort's garrison were estimated to be 15 men killed or 20 wounded. The evacuating Confederate force left all its artillery and equipment. Tideman was imprisoned for many months in exchange in August 15th. Tideman wrote bitterly in his report that Fort Henry was a wrenched military position. The history of military engineering records no parallel. Grant sent a brief dispatch to Halleck. He's, quote, "Fort Henry is ours. I shall take and destroy Fort Donelson on the 8th and return to Fort Henry." Halleck wired Washington, D.C., "Fort Henry is ours. The flag reestablished on the soil of Tennessee. It will never be removed." Grant and his troops arrived at Fort Henry at around 3 p.m. on February 6 to see that the garrison had already surrendered. McClernand's division arrived at the fort about later. In the meantime, Smith's division had reached the desert fort. If Grant had been cautious and delayed his departure by 2 days, the battle would never occurred. By February 8th, Fort Henry was completely underwater. February 7th, the Union gunboats Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Essex returned to Cairo with all of most complete and signal with Whistle's boats and flying Fort Henry's captured Confederate flags upside down. Tribune proclaimed the battle as one of the most complete and signal victories in the annals of the world's warfare. Fort Henry's fall quickly opened the Tennessee to Union gunboats and shipping south of the Alabama border. After the surrender, Footman was sent Louis Phillips with the 3 timber clans, Tyler, Cousins, and Lexington, on a mission apprised to destroy installments and supplies of military value. The Florence ironclads had substantial bombardment of Fort Henry and were slowed in less maneuvered for the mission at hand, which included the pursuit of Confederate ships. The raid reached as far as Muscle Shores, just past Florence, Alabama. The rivers near global Union timber clads and their raiding parties destroyed supplies and an important bridge of the Memphis and Ohio Railroad, 25 miles upriver. They also captured a variety of Southern ships, including sailwood, mussel, and ironclad under construction. The citizens of Florence asked Phillips to spare their town and its railroad bridge. Phillips agreed. Seeing no military importance to the bridge, one 19th century source described Phillips' raid as perfect success. It discovered the real weakness of the Confederacy in that direction. The feasible of marching an army into the heart of the Confederacy, and better than all, it deployed the most graphic evidence of the Union feeling in Tennessee and Alabama. According to the same amount, Phillips required several pro-Union Southerners to assist him during the raid. The Union gunboats returned safely to Fort Henry on February 12th. After the fall of Fort Donelson, we'll get to that in a little bit, to Grant's army on February 16th, the Tennessee and Cumberland Rivers, two major water routes in the Confederacy West, became Union waterways for the movement of troops and material, as Grant suspected the Union capture of the two forters flanked the Confederate forces at Columbus and soon caused them to withdraw from that city and from western Kentucky. The Confederates were in full retreat out of western Tennessee and Columbus.
Don't
cry, Twilight. I know it's sad to see you go to a cemetery, but it happened in the past, and it's okay. So.
Oh, you're very sweet.
You're welcome, Twilight. Now, let's go to the next battlefield. Let's go. We're here. I'm here on Roanoke Island at the Fort Raleigh National Battlefield Visitor Center, and this is where the battle is. This is the Fort Raleigh, and it was during the Battle of Roanoke Island. Now let's talk about what Roanoke Island is and was at that before the battle even happened. The opening phrase of what came to be called the Burnside Expedition, the Battle of Roanoke Island, was an empress operation of the American Civil War, fought on February 7th and February 8th, 1862, in the North Carolina Sounds of a short distance south of the Virginia border. The attacking force consisted of flotilla of gunboats and of the Union Navy drawn from the North Atlantic Blockade Squadron, commanded by Flag Officer Lewis M. Goldsborough. A separate group of the gunboats under Army control and an Army division led by Brigadier General Ambrose Burnside. The defenders were a group of gunboats from the Confederate States Navy termed the Mosquito Fleet under Captain William F. Lunch, and about 2,000 Confederate soldiers commanded located by Brigadier General Henry A. Wise. The defense was used by 4 forts facing on the water approaches to Roanoke Island and 2 sleeping batteries at the time of the battle. Wise was hospitalized, so leadership fell to his second-in-command, Colonel Henry M. Shamon. During the first day of the battle, the Federal gunboats on the forts on shore engaged in a gun battle, which occasionally contributes to the Mosquito Fleet. Late in the day, Burnside's soldiers went ashore unopposed. They were accompanied by 6 howitzers managed by 6 sailors. As it was too late to fight, the invaders went into the camp for the night. On the second day, February 8th, the Union soldiers advanced, but were stopped by an artillery battery and accompanied infantry in the center of the island. Although the Confederates thought that their line was safely secured in impenetrable swamps, they were flanked on both sides, and the soldiers were driven back to refuge in their forts. The forts were taken in reserve, with no way for his men to escape. Colonel Shawn surrendered to avoid pointless bloodshed.
Yeah, that was all cool what Parker just said there.
Yeah, definitely was. But now, here's Parker. Now let's talk about North Carolina and see how it was. All this was before Roanoke Island and stuff.
So Parker, talk to us about North Carolina.
Northeastern North Carolina is dominated by its sounds, enlarged by shallow bodies of blackish to salt water that lie between the mainland and the Outer Banks. Although they are all one body, fluided, connected, and having a common water level, they are considered divided into several distant regions. The largest of these is Paramount Sound, immediately behind Hassels Island to its north, and second largest Agor Sound, which extends to almost the southern border of Virginia. The linkage between these two, somewhat narrow, is further constructed by Roanoke Island, the portion of the waterway between Roanoke Island and the mainland known as the Coburn South. Both the island and the south are about 10 miles, 16 kilometers long. The sound of its widest point is a little more than 4 miles, 6.4 kilometers across. The island is about half that. On the eastern side of the island is Roanoke Sound, much narrower, shallower, and less important. Yeah, it sure was. Several North Carolina cities were sited on the sounds, among them New Bern, usually written New Ernie, in the middle 19th century, Bruford, Edmond, and Elizabeth City. Others not lying directly on the sounds were sailed to the rivers and imported into them. As much as a third of the state is in their washed through most of the first year of the Civil War. The Confederate forces retained control of the sounds, so they coast-wise waterborne commerce of the eastern part of the state was impeded. The sounds were linked to Norfolk, Virginia, and the Almandarin in the Cheapskate Canal and the Demerzel Swamp Canal. The blockade of Norfolk could not be complete so long as canoes could reach the city through the back door. Communications were not affected immediately when federal forces captured the forts on the Outer Banks at the Harrison's Island in August 1861, as the Union Navy could not bring its deep water vessels into the South through the shallow inlets. Roanoke Island was the key to control the sounds. If controlled by the Union forces, they would have a base that could be attacked only by an infantry or operation, which the rebels could not mount. If the Union established naval superiority there, all points of the main line shores would be equivalent variable to an assault. The Confederate defenders would be forced into an impossible situation. They would either have to give up some positions without a fight, or they would have to spread their assets too thin to be of any use. Now let's talk about the prelude of the battle. Here we go. Confederate defense. The defense of Roanoke Island started in an accidental manner when the Federal fleet appeared off Harrison's Inlet on August 27, 1861. The 3rd Georgia Infantry Regiment was hastily sent from Norfolk to help hold the forts there, but the forts fell before they arrived, so they were diverted to Roanoke Island. They remained there for the next 3 months, making somewhat disordered efforts to appel the Union forces to Harrison's Island. Little was done to secure the position until early October, when Brigadier General Hill was assigned to command the coastal defenses of North Carolina. And the victim of the Sounds, who was sent his soldiers to putting up earthworks across the center of the island, but he was called away to serve in Virginia before they were completed. Shortly after his departure, the district was split in two. The southern part was assigned to Brigadier General Lawrence O. B. Branch, while the northern part was put in control of Henry A. Wise, whose command included Almenering Sound and Roken Island, but not Powerful Sound in its cities. It is also significant that the branch reported to Brigadier General Richard C. Ganton, who commanded the Department of North Carolina, while Rise was under Major General Benjamin Hugh, who was in charge of the defense of North Fork. Wise had been commander of the so-called Wise Legion, but his troops did not accompany him. The Legion was broken up, although he was able to retain two of his old regiments, the 46th and 59th Virginia. He also had 3 regiments of North Carolina troops, the 2nd, 8th, and 31st North Carolina, plus 3 companies of the 17th North Carolina. The men of the North Carolina were ill-equipped and poorly clothed, often armed with nothing more than their own shotguns. All told, the number came to about 1,400 infantrymen, but the number available for duty was smaller than that because the living conditions put so many men as 1/4 of the command on the sick list. My gosh. Wise begged Richmond to send him some guns as Hill before him, but the numbers were actually sent at arrogant. They were disputed into several noble forts facing Conjurn Sound, where 12 guns in Fort Huger at Wheels Point. The northwestern corner of the island, 4 guns, and Fort Bladstone about a mile, 1.6 kilometers to the southeast, and 9 guns at Fort Bertow at Pork Point, about a quarter of the way down the island across the sound at Redstone Point, opposite Fort Hunger. 2 old canal bargains have been pushed up onto the mud, protected by sandbags and cotton bales, armed with 7 guns and named Fort Forest. These were all the guns that would bear on the sound, the southern half of the island, nearest Protocol Sound, and the direction from which the attack would come was protected. 5 other guns did not face the Conjurn Sound. A battery of 2 guns on the eastern side of the island protected as against possible assault across Roken Sound, and 3 others occupied an earthworm near the terminal center of the island. Wise made one other contribute to the defense. He found some pile drivings and was able to impale the sound between the forts Hunger and Forest by a double row of piles, arguing by sunken halts. The barrier was still being worked on when the attack came. The Confederate Navy also made a contribute to the defense. 7 gunboats, mounting a total of only 8 guns, formed the Mosquito Fleet, commanded by Flag Officer William F. Lynch. Wise, for one, believed that their net contribute was negative. Not only were their guns taken from the forts on the island, but so were their crews. He gave vent to his feelings after the battle. Captain Lynch was energetic, jealous, and active, but he gave too much consequence entirely to his fleet of gunboats, with hidden transportation of piles of lumber, voyage supplies of all kinds, and of troops, by taking away the steam tugs and converting them into perfectly endurable gunboats. Despite Wise's disapproval, the Mosquito Fleet was a part of the defense, and the Union forces would have to deal with it. Now let's talk about the Union side. Union offensive. A short time after Hayton's Island was captured for the Union, Burnside began to promote the idea of a coast division to be composed of fishermen, dock workers, and other watermen from the northeastern states, and used to attack coastal areas. He reasoned that such men were already familiar with ships, and therefore would be easy to train for ambush operations. Burnside was a close friend of General-in-Chief George B. McClellan. We'll get to him in another video. So he got respectful hearing, although Burnside had initially intended to operate in Chesapeake Bay in the hands of McClellan in the War Department. His ideas were soon transferred into a planned assault on the North Carolina intercoast, beginning with Roanoke Island. And an unspoken reason for the change of target was the mistaken belief that pro-Union sentiment was being suppressed in North Carolina. An invasion would allow them to impress their true loyalists. When it was fleshed out, the invasion of North Carolina came to be known as the Burnside Expedition. Yep, they called it that. As requiring progressed, Burnside organized the coast division into three brigades, led by three friends from his military academy brigades. Day's Brigade General John G. Forster led the first brigade. Brigade General Jesse Lee Rideau the second, and Brigade General John G. Parker, that's my name, the third. In early January, nearly 13,000 men were ready for duty. Although the Union Navy would provide most of the garrison that was needed to suppress the rebel batteries, Burnside decided to have some gunboats under Army control. This immediately led to some inference between two services. The Navy had no vessels and sturdy enough to go to sea, and at the same time draw enough little water to be able to pass through the inlet through about 8 feet. Then they therefore had to buy suitable merchant ships for their conversation, and at the very time that Burnside and his agents were also the dickering for their ships, because the sailors were more experienced, they were able to get the most of the more suitable ships. The army was led with a mixed bag of rickety ships that were barely seaworthy. By the time the expedition got underway, the Navy had 20 gunboats, and the coast division had 9. The Armady was supplied mended by several canal boats converted into floating batteries, mounting boat howsers, and protected the sandbags and bases of hay, and told the expedition carried 108 pieces of organized. While While Burnside's agents were pushing the gunboats, they were also buying or leasing other vessels to be used as transports. The soldiers and the transports for their expedition assembled at Annapolis. Urgent began on January 5th, 1862, and on January 9th, they began to get underway with orders of recommends at Fort Monroe, near the entrance to Chesapeake Bay. There they met the Navy Conqueror, and on January 11th, they set sail. Until this time, only Burnside and his immediate staff knew the ultimate decision. Once at sea, the captain of each ship opened his sealed orders and leaned that his ship should precede the victory of Cape Henson.
Okay, sorry. So now you want to hear about the battle now. I thought you may. Here you go.
From Chesapeake Bay to Palo Sound, for many of the Federal soldiers, the voyage to Hendricks Inlet was the worst part of the battle, earning its reputation. The weather in the vicinity of Capper's Idris turned foul, causing many of them to become seasick. In an act of bravo, Burnside left his comfortable quarters aboard the transport George Peabody. Peabody, what? And with his staff went aboard Army gunboat Pickett. He chose this vessel because he considered her to be the least seaworthy ship in his command. By showing his troops that he was willing to share their misery, he earned their devoted when the storm struck. He began to doubt the wisdom of his move, but Pickett survived and got him safety to his destination. 3 vessels in the Armenian were not so lucky. City of New York, land of ordnance and supplies, Pocahontas carrying horses, and Army gunboat Zover were all lost. Although all persons aboarded were rescued, the only personal losses were 2 officers of the 9th New Jersey who were drowned when the surf boat overturned following a visit to the flagship. Yep. The entry into the Parallel Sound through the Idris Inlet was time-consuming. The squash, through thought to be 8 feet and 2.4 meters deep, was found the hard way to be only 6 feet. Some of the Union Army ships drew too much to get across and had to be heeled after being light, and others were too deep even to nudge in. The men or materials they carried had to be brought ashore on the Hurricane's Island, and the ships sent back Bark John Trunks never made it at all. She could not get close enough to Hampton's Island even for the men aborted to be taken off. She returned to Annapolis with the majority of the regiment. The 53rd New York and only a defense of the command was active in the Battle of Roanoke Island. Not until February 4th was the fleet as ready as ever would be and assembled in Palomas Sound. While the Northern fleet was struggling over the bar, the Confederates were strandedly inert. No reinforcements were sent to the island, nor for the matter, any of the other possible targets in the region. The number of infantry men on the island remained at about 1,400, with 800 in reserve at Nag's Head. The majority change was negative. On February 1st, Wise came down with what he called Peregrine with high fever and spitting of blood, threatening pneumonia. He was confined to bed at Nag's Head and remained hospitalized until February 8th. After the battle was over, although he continued to issue orders, effectively command on Roanoke Island fell to Colonel H.M. Shawn on the 8th North Carolina Infantry. Now here's the first day of what happened on the battle. First day, bombardment. The fleet got underway early the morning after they assembled in the Sound, February 5th, and by nightfall were near the southern end of Roanoke Island, where they anchored. Rain and strong winds prevented movements the next day. The major activity was Goldenboro's shift of his flag from USS Philadelphia to Southfield. On February 7th, the weather moderated and the Navy gunboats got into position. They first fired a few shells inland at Ashby Harbor. They attended landing place and determined that the defenders had no batteries there. They then moved up Croson Sound, where they were divided. Sorry about that. Some were ordered to fire on the fort at Pork Point, Fort Beartow. I said about that earlier. While others were to concreted their fire on the 7 vessels of the Mosquito Fleet. At about noon, the bombardment began. The weakness of the Confederate position was revealed at this time. Only 4 of the guns at Fort Beartow would bear on the Union gunboats. Forts Huger and Blanchard could not contribute at all. Fort Forrest, on the other side of the Sound, was rendered completely useless when gunboat CSS Cruising halted at the waterline, ran ashore directly in front it in her effort to avoid sinking, and in doing so missed the guns of the fort. Losses were light on both sides despite the intensity of the fight. Several of the Union ships were hit, but none suffered severe damage. This was true for the Confederates also, aside from the cruising, but the remaining Mosquito Fleet had to retire simply because they ran out of ammunition. The Army transports, accompanied by its gunboats, had in the meantime arrived at Ashby Harbor, near the midpoint of the island at 15 o'clock. Burnside ordered the landings to begin, and at 16 the troops were reaching ashore. A 200-man strong Confederate force commanded by Colonel John V. Jordan, 31st North Carolina, in position to oppose the landing, was discovered and fired on by the gunboats. The defenders fled without any attempt to return fire. There was no further operation. Almost of the 10,000 men present were ashore by midnight. With the infantry went 6 launches with boat howitzers commanded by a young midshipman, Benjamin H. Porter. The Union soldiers pushed inland a short distance, and they went into camp for the night. Now this is the second day. Union advance and Confederate surrender. The Federal soldiers moved out promptly on the morning of February 8th, advancing north on the only road on the island. Leading was the 1st Brigade's 25th Massachusetts, with midshipman Porter's howitzers immediately followed. They soon halted when they struck the Confederate rebound, with some 400 infantry blocking their path. Another 1,000 Confederates were in reserve about 250 yards to the rear. The front was so constructed that Colonel Shaw could develop only a quarter of his men. The defense line ended with a diminuted inward swamps on both sides, so Shaw did not protect his flanks. The leading elements of the 1st Brigade spread out to match their opponents. confidency, and for 2 hours the combats fired at each other through blinding clouds of smoke. The 10th Connecticut relieved the exhausted, but not badly blooded, the 25th Massachusetts, but they too could not advance. No progress was made until the 2nd Brigade arrived, and it was commanded by Brigade General Jesse Lee Reno, ordered them to try to prevent it from the infallible swamp on the Union left. Brigade General John G. Foster then ordered 2 of his reserve regiments to do the same thing at about this time. Brigade General John G. Parker again came up to the 3rd Brigade and was immediately sent to assist. Although they were not conjunctioned, the 2 flanking movements emerged from the swamp at nearly the same time. Reno ordered his 21st Massachusetts, 51st New York, and 9th New Jersey to attack as they were firing on the Confederates. The 23rd Massachusetts from the 1st Brigade appeared on the other end of the line. The defense line began to crack. Noted this, Foster ordered his remaining forces to attack under the assault from 3 sides. The Confederates broke and fled. As no fallback defenses had been set up, he was reef of artillery. Colonel Shawn surrendered to Foster. Included in captivity he were not only the 1,400 infantry that he commanded directly, but also the guns in the forts. 2 additional regiments, 2nd North Carolina and the 46th Virginia, had been sent as reinforcements. They arrived too late to take part in the battle, but not too late to take part in the surrender. All together, with some 2,500 men, became prisoners of war. Aside from the men who went into captivity, casualties were rarely light by the American Civil War standards. The Federal forces lost 37 killed, 14 wounded, and 13 missing. The Confederates lost 23 killed, 58 wounded, and 62 missing. Here's now the aftermatch of the battle. Here we go. Aftermatch. Roanoke Island remained in Union control for the rest of the war. Immediately after the battle, the Federal gunboats passed the now slight Confederate forts into Albany Sound and destroyed what was left of the Mosquito fleet at the Battle of Elizabeth City. Burnside used the island as staging ground for later assaults on New Bern and Fort Macon, resulting in their capture. Several minor expeditions took other towns on the Sounds. The Burnside expedition ended on only in July, when its leader was called to Virginia to take part in the Richmond campaign. After Burnside left, North Carolina ceased to be an active center of war. With only two expeditions, no notable military actions took place until the last days of the conflict, when the Second Battle of Fort Fisher closed Wilmington, the last open port in the Confederacy. The Army classified the slaves on Roanoke Island as contraband, and by late 1862, hundreds more escaped slaves had joined them. While Foster was commander of the Department of North Carolina in 1863, he appointed Horace H. James a conditional campaign as superintendent of Negro affairs of the North Carolina district, encouraging him to support the former slaves in becoming educated, growing their own food, and working based in New Bern. James supervised the Trent River contraband camp there, but decided to make Roanoke Island a self-sustainable colony, the Freemen's colonial of Roanoke Island. It was an important model that lasted for 4 years and had a sawmill established by fishermen by 1864, and it had 2,200 residents. It was overcrowded when residents launched 3,900 at its peak. It in part became poor soil on the island, limited productive of agriculture. Many of its people worked for the army of Whigs, and more than 150 men enlisted in the United States colored troops. Missionary teachers recruited by the American Missionary Society taught reading and writing to classes, both children and adults. It was an important step towards citizenship for their freedmen.
Oh my god, dude. Okay, I think I've done enough. Now we're gonna head back to Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, but now I'm gonna talk to you about the Battle of Fort Donelson, not Fort Henry. I know it's the same battlefield park, but hey, get to enjoy the view again of the river, so let's go. Now we're back here at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Now let's talk about Fort Donelson. And I'm gonna go through everything. First, let me give you the background of how it was here and what it was before the Civil War.
The Battle of Fort Donelson was fought from February 11th to 16th, 1862, in the Western Theater of the American Civil War. The Union capture of the Confederate fort near the Tennessee-Kentucky border opened the Cumberland River, an important average for the invasion of the South. The Union's success also elevated Brigadier General Ulysses Grant from an obscure and largely unproven unconditional surrender. It improved the leader of the rank of the Major General and earned him the nickname of Unconditional Surrender of Grant. Following the capture of Fort Henry on February 6, Grant moved his army later to become the Union's Army of the Tennessee, 12 miles, 19 kilometers, overland to Fort Donelson from February 11th to 13th, and conducted several small prohibiting attacks on February 14th. Union gunboats under Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote attempted to reduce the fort with gunfire, but were forced to withdraw after sustaining heavy damage from the fort's water batteries. On February 15th, with the fort surrounded, the Confederates, commanded by Brigadier General John B. Floyd, launched a surprise attack led by his second-in-command Brigadier General Gibson Johnston Pillow against the right flank of Grant's army. The intention was to open an escape route to retreat to Nashville, Tennessee. Grant was away from the battlefield at the start of the attack, but arrived to rally his men and counterattack. Pillow's attack succeeded in opening the route, but Floyd lost his nerve and ordered his men back to the fort. The following morning, Floyd and Pillow escaped with a small detachment of troops. Reconfederacy command to Brigadier General Simon Olbard Bunker, who attempted Grant's demand of unconditional surrender later that evening. The battle resulted in a withdrawal of all of Kentucky, as well as much of Tennessee, including Nashville, falling under Union control. Now let's talk about the battle. Primary movements and attacks, February 12th to February 13th. On February 12th, most of the Union troops departed Fort Henry, where they were waiting for the return of Union gunboats and the arrival of additional troops that would increase the Union forces to about 25,000 men. The Union forces proceeded about 5 miles, 8 kilometers, onto the two main roads leading between the two forts. They were delayed most of the day by a cavalry screen commanded by Nathan Bearfort Forrest. Forrest's troops sent out a bunker, spotted a detachment from McClernand's division, and opened fire against them. A brief skirmish ensued until orders from Buckner arrived to fall back within the entrenchments. After this withdrawal of Forrest's cavalry, the Union troops moved closer to the Confederate defense line, while trying to cover any possible Confederate escape routes. McClernand's division made up the right of Grant's army, with C.F. Smith's division forming the left. U.S.S. Carden was the first gunboat to arrive up the river, and she promptly fired numerous shells into the fort, testing its defenses before retrying. Grant arrived on February 12th and established his headquarters near the left side of the front line at Wilco Cribb's house. On February 11th, Buckner relayed orders to Pillows from Floyd to the released Floyd's and Buckner's troops to operate the south of the river, near Cumberland City, where they would be able to attack the Union supply lines while keeping a clear path back to Nashville. However, this would leave the Confederate forces at Fort Donelson heavily outnumbered. General Pillow left early on the morning of February 12th to argue these orders, with General Floyd himself leaving Buckner in charge of the fort. After hearing sounds of artillery fire, Pillow returned to Fort Donelson to resume command. After the events of the day, Buckner remained at Fort Donelson to command the Confederate right. With the arrival of Grant's army, General Johnston ordered Floyd to take any troops remaining at Clarksville to aid in the defense of Fort Donelson. On February 13th, several small probing attacks were carried out against the Confederate defenses, easily ignoring orders from Grant that no general engagement will be provoked. On the Union left, C.F. Smith sent 2 of his 4 brigades under Colonel Jacob Larman and John Cook to test the defenses along his front. The attacks suffered light casualties and made no gains, but Smith was able to keep up a harassing fire throughout the night. On the right, McClernand also ordered an unauthorized attack. Two regiments of Colonel William R. Morgan's brigade, along with 1 regiment, the 48th Illinois, from Colonel W.H.L. Walser brigade, were ordered to seize a battery, Rendon number 2, that had been halting their position. Eisen and Henner, Colonel of the 48th Illinois, was senior in rank to Colonel Morrison, although rightfully in command of 2 of the 3 regiments. Morrison's volunteered to turn over command once the attack was underway. However, when the attack began, Morganson was wounded, eliminating any leadership, and for unknown reasons, Henry never fully took control of the attack. Was repulsed. Some wounded men caught between the lines burned to death in grass fires ignited by the artillery. General Grant had Commander Henry Walter being the called up on the Cumberland River to create a diversion by opening fire on the fort. The Confederates responded with shots from their long-range guns and eventually hit the gunboat. Walk retreated several miles below the fort, but soon returned and continued shelling the water batteries. General McClellan, in the meantime, had been attempting to stretch his men towards the river, but ran into difficulties with a Confederate battery of guns. McClellan ultimately decided that he did not have enough men to stretch all the way to the river, so Grant decided to call on more troops. He sent orders to General Walton, who had been left behind at Fort Henry, to bring his men to Fort Donelson. With Floyd's arrival to take command of Fort Donelson, Pillow took over leading the Confederate left. Feeling overwhelmed, Floyd left most of the actual command to Pillow and Buckner. At the end of the day, there had been several skirmishes, but the positions of the side were estimatedly the same. The night progressed with both sides fighting the cold weather. Although the weather had been mostly rainy up to the point in the campaign, a snowstorm arrived the night of February 13th with strong winds that brought temperatures down to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 12 degrees Celsius, and a disposition 3 inches 8 centimeters of snow by morning. Guns and wagons were frozen to the earth because of the proximity of the enemy lines. The active sharpshooters, the soldiers could not light campfires for warmth and cooking, and both sides were miserable by that night, many having arrived without blankets or overcoats. Reinforcements and naval battle, February 14th. At 11 a.m. on February 14th, Floyd held a council of war in his headquarters at the Dover Hotel. There was general agreement that Fort Donelson was probably untenable. General Pillow was decided to lead a breakout attempt, evacuate the fort, and march to Nashville. Troops were moved between the lines, and the assaulted retreated, and they broke through the Union lines, but Grant sent them back to Fort Donelson reeling. Pillow normally quit aggressive in battle and was unnerved and announced that since their movement had been detected, the breakout was a setback. On February 14th, General Law Walter's brigade arrived at Fort Henry around noon, and Floyd arrived on the Cumberland River in mid-afternoon, bringing 6 gunboats and another 10,000 Union reinforcements on the 12 transport ships. Walt assembled these new troops to a 3rd division of 2 brigades under Colonel John M. Thratner and Charles Clough, and occupied the center of the line facing the Confederate trenches. This provided Suffragan troops to extend McClellan's right flank to be anchored on Lick Creek by moving Colonel John MacArthur's brigade of Smith's division from the reserve to a position from which they intended to plug the 400 yards 370 millimeters gap at dawn the next morning. As soon as Foote arrived, Grant urged him to attack the fort's river batteries. Although Foote was reclined to proceed before adequate reconnaissance, he moved his gunboats close to the shore by 3 p.m. and opened fire just as he had done at Fort Henry. The Confederate artillery pummeled the fleet with heavy cannon fire, and the assault was over by 4:30 p.m. Foote was wounded considerably in his foot. The wheelhouse of his flagship USS St. Louis was carried away, and she floated helplessly downriver. USS Louisiana was also disabled, and when the Pittsburgh began to take on water, the damage to the fleet was significant, and it retreated downriver. Of the 500 Confederate shots fired, St. Louis was hit 59 times, Carlisle 54, Louisville 36, and Pittsburgh 20 times. Foote have miscalculated the assault. Historical Kendall Gotten suggested that it would have been more pursued to stay as far downriver as possible, and use the fleet's longer range guns to reduce the fort. An alternate might have been to overrun the batteries, probably at nighttime, as would be done successfully into the 1863 Vicksburg campaign, which we'll talk about another time. Once the Union fleet was past the fixed river batteries, Fort Donelson would have been defenseless. 8 Union sailors were killed and 44 were wounded, while the Confederates lost none. Captain Joseph Dickinson of the river batteries had been killed the previous day during cavalry's bombardment. On land, the well-armed Union soldiers surrounded the Confederates, while Union boats, although damaged, still controlled the river. Grant realized that any success at Fort Donelson would have to be carried by the army without strong naval support, and wired Halter that he might have to resort to a siege. Breakout attempt, February 15th. Despite their unexpected naval success, the Confederate generals were still skeptical about their chances in the fort and held another late-night council of war, where they decided to retry their obscure escape plan at dawn on February 15th. The Confederates launched an assault led by Pillow against McClernand's division on the unprotected right flank of the Union line. The Union troops, unable to sleep in the cold weather, were not caught entirely by supplies, but Grant was not expecting a land assault from the Confederates. He was up before dawn and had to head it off to visit flank officer Foote on his flagship downriver. Grant left orders that none of his generals was to ignite an engagement, and no one was assigned as second in command during his episode. The Confederate plan was for Pillow to push McClernand away and take control of the Ward's Ferry and Forge roads, the main routes to Nashville. Buckner was to move his division across Ward's Ferry Road and act as rear guard for the remainder of the army as it withdrew from Fort Donelson and moved east. A long regiment from Buckner's division, the 30th Tennessee, was designed to stay in the trenches and prevent a Federal pursuit. The attack started well. After 2 hours of heavy fighting, Pillow's men pushed McClernand's line back and opened the escape route. It was this attack that the Union troops in the West heard the famous Enviro Rebel yell. The attack was initially successful because of the inexperienced and poor positioning of McClernand's troops and the flanking attack from the Confederate cavalry under Forrest. The Union brigades of Colonel Richmond Obliz and John MacArthur were hit hardest. They withdrew in generally orderly manner to the rear for regrouping and resupply. At around 8 a.m., McClernand sent a message requesting assistance from Louis Walser, but Walser had no orders from Grant, who was still absent, to respond to an attack on fellow officer, and declined the initial request. Walser, who hesitated to disobey orders, sent an aside to Grant's headquarters for further instructions. In the meantime, McClernand's ammunition was running out, but his withdrawal was not yet a rout. The army, former Quartermaster Ulysses S. Grant had not yet learned to reorganize, reserve ammunition and supplies near the front line brigades. A second messenger arrived at Walton's camp in tears, crying, "Our right flank is turned. The whole army is in danger." This time, Walton sent a brigade under Colonel Charles Clough to aid McClellan. Clough's brigade was sent to replace Obliss's and MacArthur's brigades. But when they realized they had run into Pillow's Confederates and were also being flanked, they began to fall back. Not everything was going well with the Confederate advance. By 9:30 a.m., as the lead Union brigades were falling back, Nathan Balfour urged Bushrod Johnston to launch an all-out attack on the disorganized troops. Johnston was too cautious to approve of a general assault, but he did not agree to keep the infantry moving slowly forward. 2 hours into the battle, General Pillow realized that Buckner's wing was not attacking alongside his. After a confrontation between the two generals, Buckner's troops moved out and combined with the right flank of Pillow's wing hit W.H.L. Walter's brigade. The Confederates took control of the Fort Road and a key section of the Wooden Ferry Road, opening a route to Nashville. Buckner's delay provided time for Lee's and Walter's men to reinforce McClernand's retreating forces before they were completely routed. Despite Grant's early orders, Walter's units moved on the right flank with their brigades, giving McClernand's men time to regroup and gather ammunition from Walt's supplies. The 68th Ohio was left behind to protect the rear. The Confederate offensive ended at around 12:30 p.m. when Walters and 3rd Union troops formed a defense line on the range outside Walton's Ferry Road. The Confederates assaulted them 3 times, but were unsuccessful and withdrew to a ridge 0.5 miles, 0.80 kilometers away. Nevertheless, they had a good morning. The Confederates had pushed the Union defenders back to 1 or 2 miles to 3 kilometers and had opened their escape route. Grant, who was apparently unaware of the battle, was notified by a sign and returned his troops in the early afternoon. Grant first visited C.F. Smith on the Union left, where Grant ordered the 8th Missouri and 11th Indiana to the Union right, then rode 7 miles over icy roads to find McClernand and Waltz. Grant was dismayed at the confusion and lack of organized leadership. McClernand grumbled. "This army was ahead," Grant replied. "It seems so, gentlemen. The position on the right must be retaken." True to his nature, Grant did not panic at the Confederate assault. As Grant rode back from the river, he heard the sounds of guns and sent word to foot to begin a demoralization of naval gunfire. Assuming that his troops would be demoralized, that he could encourage, but Grant observed that some of the Confederate Buckners were fighting with knapsacks filled with 3 days of rations, which impelled to him that they were attempting to escape, not pursuing for a combat victory. He told an aside that the one who attacks first now would be victorious. "The enemy will have to be in a hurry if he gets ahead of me." Despite the successful morning attack, access to opening escape route, and to the amazement of Floyd and Buckner, Pillow ordered his men back to their trenches. By 1:30 p.m., Buckner confronted Pillow and Floyd and attempted to countermanded the order, but Pillow argued that his men needed to regroup and resupply before evacuating the fort. Pillow won the argument. Floyd also believed that the C.F. Smith's division was being heavily reinforced, so the entire Confederate force was ordered back instead inside the lines of Fort Donelson, giving up the ground they gained earlier that day. Grant moved quickly to exploit the opening and told Smith, "All has failed on our right. You must take Fort Donelson." Smith replied, "I will do it." Smith formed his 2 remaining brigades to make an attack. Lawson's brigade would be the main attack, spearheaded by Colonel James Turtle's 2nd Iowa Infantry. Cook's brigade would be in support of the right rear and act as federal to draw fire away from Lawman's Bridge. Smith's 2 brigade attacked quickly, seized the outer lines of entrenchments on the Confederate right. On the 30th Tennessee, commanded by Colonel John W. Head, who had been left behind from Buckner's division. Despite 2 hours of repeated counterattacks, the Confederates could not repel Smith from the captured earthworks. The Union was now poised to siege Fort Donelson and its river batteries when light returned the next morning. In the meantime, on the Union right, Lew Waltz formed an attacking column with 3 brigades, 1 from his own division, 1 from McClernand's, and 1 from Smith's, to try and regain control of the ground lost in the battle that morning. Walt's old brigade of Zos, 11th Indiana and 8th Missouri, now commanded by Colonel Morgan L. Smith, and others from McClernand's and Walt's divisions were chosen to lead the attack. The brigades of Clough, Waltzer's division, and Leonard's F. Ross, McClernand's division, were placed in support on the flanks. Waltz ordered the attack forward. Smith and the 8th Missouri and the 11th Indiana advanced a short distance up the hill, using zone tactics where the men repeatedly rushed and then fell to the ground in prone position. By 5:30 p.m., Walter's troops had succeeded in retaking the ground lost that morning, and by nightfall the Confederate troops had been driven back to their original positions. Grant began plans to resume his assault in the morning, although neglectfully to close the escape route that Pillow had opened. John A. Logan was gravely injured on February 15th. Soon after the victory at Donelson, he was promoted to brigade general in the Volunteers. Surrender, February 16th. Nearly 1,000 soldiers on both sides had been killed, with about 3,000 wounded still on the field. Some froze to death in the snowstorm, many Union soldiers having thrown away their blankets and coats. Inexplicably, Generals Floyd and Pillow were unbeat about the day's performance and wired General Johnston at Nashville that they had won a great victory. General Simon Boulevard Buckner, however, they argued that they were in despite position that was getting worse with the arrival of Union reinforcements. At their final council of war in the Dover Hotel at 1:30 a.m. on February 16th, Buckner stated that if C.F. Smith attacked again, he could only hold for 30 minutes, and he estimated that the cost of defending the fort would be as high as a 75th% casualty rate. Buckner's position finally carried the meeting. Any large-scale escape would be difficult. Most of the river transports were currently transporting wounded men to Nashville and would not return in time to evacuate the command. Floyd, who believed if he was captured he would induct the Corps position during his service as Secretary of War in President James Buchanan's cabinet before the war, promptly turned over his command to Pillow, who also feared northern reprisals. In turn, Pillow passed the command to Buckner, who agreed to remain behind and surrender the army. During the night, Pillow escaped by a small boat across the Cumberland. Floyd left the next morning by the only steamer available, taking his 2 regiments of Virginia infantry disguised as the show of coward. A furious Nathan Balfour Forrest announced, "I did not come here to surrender my commander." He stormed out the meeting and led about 700 of his cavalrymen on their escape from the fort. Forrest's horsemen rode toward Nashville, though the shallow, icy waters of Leak Creek, encountering no enemy and confirming that many more men could have escaped by the same route if Buckner had not positioned guards to prevent any such attempts. On the morning of February 16th, Buckner sent a note to Grant requesting a truce and asking for terms of surrender. The note first reached General Smith, who exclaimed, "No terms to the damned rebels." When the note reached Grant, Smith urged him to offer no terms. Buckner had hoped that Grant would offer generous terms because of their early friendship. In 1854, Grant was removed from command at the U.S. Army post in California, alleged because of alcoholics. Buckner, a fellow U.S. Army officer at the time, loaded Grant money to return home to Illinois after Grant had been forced to resign his commission. To Buckner's dismay, Grant showed no mercy towards men rebelling against the federal government. Grant's personal reply, because of one of them, became one of the most famous quotes of the war, earning him the nickname of Unconditional Surrender. General S.B. Buckner, Confederate Army. Sir, yours of this state proposing armistice and appointed of commissioners to settle terms of captivity is just received. No terms, expect unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. I am, sir, very respectful, your observed U.S. Grant, Brigade General. Grant was not bluffing. Smith was now in good position to move on to the fort, having captured the outer lines of its fortifications, and was under orders to launch an attack with the support of other divisions the following day. Grant believed his position allowed him to forge a planned siege by successfully storming the fort. Buckner's response to Grant's demand: "Sir, this distribution of forces under my command, insane to expected change of commanders, and the overwhelming force under your control compelled me, notwithstanding the brilliant success of the Confederate arms yesterday, to accept ungenerous and excellent terms with your propose." Grant, who was contentious to Buckner's following the surrender, offered to load him money to see him through the impending imprisonment, but Buckner declined. The surrender was a personal humiliation for Buckner and a tragical defeat of the Confederacy, which lost more than 12,000 men, 48 artillery pieces, much of their equipment, and control of the Cumberland River, which led to the evacuation of Nashville. This was the first of 3 Confederate armies that Grant would capture during the war. The second was John C. Pemberton's at the siege of Vicksburg, and the third of Robert E. Lee's army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox. Buckner also turned over considerable military equipment and provisions which Grant's troops badly needed. More than 7,000 Confederate prisoners of the war were eventually transported from Fort Donelson to Camp Douglas in Chicago, Camp Morton in Indianapolis, and other prison camps elsewhere in the North. Buckner was held as a prisoner at Fort Warren in Boston until he was exchanged in August 1862. And there you go. That was Fort Donelson.
Okay, that was the Battle of Fort Donelson. Now, let's go home now. Since we're tired, we gone to we gone to 2 battlefields, but we talked about 3 battles. So let's go back home.
I'm tired now. Aren't you, Sonic and Meg?
Indeed we are.
Yes, that was so tiring.
I know. Hopefully it doesn't get so more tiring than this.
Come kiss me, Parker.
Oh no. Oh gosh. Well, here we go. Twilight and me gonna go at it again.
Oh, Twilight.
Oh, Parker, I love kissing you.